workplace interventions in the context of serious sectarian divisions and tensions, working with paramilitaries, doing paramilitary mediation, working with ex-prisoner groups. And that was our work up until about 2008, and it changed significantly with the global financial crash. And we were asked by some trade unionists in Belfast, could you explain what just happened? Can you explain the crash? And we said, no, go back to your education departments. They'll be able to do that for you. And then they came back to us and said, no, they don't know why it happened either. And so we started designing and delivering lots of political education and political economy work within the labour movement. An aspect of that was the rise of the far right, because as soon as 2008 hit, there was an acceleration of far right organising, both on the streets, but also in political spaces. And the other aspect of our work was, over the years, a very small part of our work was monitoring the links between loyalist paramilitaries and the far right in Britain and Europe. And that was always there. But the far right never quite managed to organise very well in Northern Ireland for unique kind of contextual reasons here. Also because of the intervention of the labour movement to kind of make sure that to split, if you like, that. And we always said our analysis was always that the links between the far right in Britain and loyalist paramilitaries was kind of instrumental, not institutional. Anyway, but that's where we are. In terms of why we're all here today, I suppose everyone was shocked. Not shocked might be too strong a word, but everyone was kind of took notice, I suppose, of the rise of the far right after the August riots. But I think it's fair to say that those riots didn't start in those working class communities. They started in the British Houses of Parliament. They started in the editorial rooms of the mainstream press, and they've of course been supercharged by the manipulation of social media, which of course are privately owned platforms, including the amplification of far right narratives by the owners of those social media platforms as well. When rioters are kind of chanting, whatever, it's stop the boats and we want our country back, they're just parroting what they've heard in Parliament. They're parroting what they read in the Daily Mail. The great irony, of course, is some of those same politicians then kind of throw their hands up in shock when fascists are burning down shops and beating people up in the street, as if the two things are completely not linked together. So it's not enough to call out violence. That is the first point. Politicians and the establishment need to stop normalizing hatred and normalizing racism and normalizing Islamophobia, because that's what we've seen over the last 2 decades. And it's the same pattern across the globe, I would argue, which is encouraging people to obviously punch down and not look up. The resurgence of the far right and of racism itself, and Islamophobia in particular, I suppose, is not, they're not the result of popular demands coming from working class communities. They're really they're almost like the logical conclusion of the need to push reactionary ideas into the mainstream to distract us all, to distract people from the actual crises we face. And those crises are social, they're political, they're of course environmental. So mainstreaming and normalizing far right ideas are what we're here to talk about. And it does a number of things, those processes. One, it emboldens the systemic racism that already exists, of course, within institutions in Western societies. But it also legitimizes far right ideas as normal. And it also kind of increasingly convinces people that there's only 2 choices. There's defend the status quo or look for an alternative. And the only alternative for many people is the far right. And the left's in a really precarious position here. I'm talking about the left broadly, not just in Britain or Ireland, but broadly across Europe and indeed large parts of the world, is that in that sense, there is no left alternative. The alternative is the status quo or the far right. And the status quo in too many occasions is being defended by the left, including parts of the trade union movement. We're defending the way things are. And the way things are, by the way, isn't working. It's not working for the environment. It's not working for societies across the globe. And so the far right emerged then as a kind of legitimate alternative. And we can see that. I'll see if I can share this screen. Hopefully it'll work. Can you see that? I can't hear anyone. I'm just assuming you can see that.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
That's great. And so that was the report that Russ referred to. We were invited by the TUC, I think more as an external voice to help them write a report. In 2019, came out in 2020. And in that report, a number of things were predicted. And one of the predictions was that if we continued, and if Europe particularly continued down the same path, that the far right would be in government all across Europe. And now, of course, the far right are in government all across Europe. And they're threatening to take over in government in other parts of the world. They're in government in Sweden, in Finland, in Italy, in the Netherlands. They were in government in Poland. They're on the rise in France with Rassemblement National, the old French National Front. I mean, I know they've tidied themselves up for television and for media purposes, but that's a party packed full of neo-Nazis. You've got Vox on the rise in Spain. You've got Chega, I think this morning, 18-19% far right party in the tradition of Salazar, the last fascist dictator in Europe. And by the way, there's a reminder there: Europe has no problem dealing with fascists. They were very happy to deal with Salazar and Franco for 40 years. And so wherever you look in Europe, the point is you're seeing the far right on the rise. And it's been accelerated since 2008, of course, in the global financial crash. But it's really a feature of neoliberalism. It's really a feature of the last 40 years of neoliberal restructuring of the economy. Since Thatcher, since Reagan, Thatcherism and Reaganomics, you've seen the far right on the rise slowly across Europe, because what we've seen under neoliberalism is, of course, I mean, there's lots of characteristics to it. We could be here all day talking about them, but one of the fundamental characteristics of neoliberalism is a massive transfer of wealth from labor to capital, and massive and rising inequality and all of the social outcomes of that, negative social outcomes of that. In terms of what that means for the growth of the far right, is above all, the far right want power, and they're going to get power through coalition. And coalition normalizes their presence in politics. I know you're not in it anymore, but that's just to give an indication of the strength of the far right in Europe. Those are the seats in the European Parliament. You can see the left there, 35 on the GUI NGL, or the left bloc with Tiny, the Social Democrats in pink. The big blue section in the middle is the traditional conservative parties, parties of capital, parties of power, parties of the establishment. And then those kind of colours to the right, as I'm looking at it, those kind of browns, that's the various groupings of far right and extreme right parties. And they now are basically the largest bloc in the European Parliament, or certainly equal to the size of the Conservative bloc. And that should be a worry for anybody. And when you think about who the Conservatives are going to go into coalition with, who they're going to make deals with, they're not making deals with Social Democrats and Greens and Liberals. They're making deals with the far right. And so the cordon sanitaire, so-called, is gone throughout Europe, and the far right are increasingly entering power through coalitions, if not through outright victory. And so, yes, we are and should be concerned about, torchlit neo-Nazi marches in Eastern Europe, and Patriot Alternative and EDLs and Tommy Robinson marches, and the rise of racism and Islamophobia on the streets. But we should be equally concerned, if not actually more concerned, about the rise of the normalization and the mainstreaming of the far right, and the far right winning power and being allowed to enter governments by traditional conservative parties, particularly. Also some social democratic parties, by the way, have flirted with coalitions with the far right. And you can see there that AFD on the picture, what will you do for the fatherland? I mean, that's a phrase direct from the 1930s. And the implication, of course, is have white babies. And that's really what that's about. So that's what we're seeing emerge in Europe. And the AFD, by the way, are now polling as the second largest party across most of Germany. And that's a party, again, packed full of neo-Nazis. Now, the problem we have in Europe more broadly, and that includes Britain, I think, as well, is that this normalization and mainstreaming of the far right is a real danger. This is a headline from The Economist from about 2 months ago. The 3 women who will shape Europe. You might think it would be a hit piece on, Frau Genocide there, von der Leyen, Meloni in Italy, or Le Pen for a Rassemblement, but it's not. It's a puff piece. And to face the perils Europe has in the future, we need coherent leadership. It also needs to keep extremists out of power. Now, in that one sentence, they're mainstreaming those 3 women and their political traditions, particularly Meloni and Le Pen, as not being extreme. And so that's a shifting of the Overton window. That's the shifting of what's permissible and what's normal in politics. So now you have 2 extreme right parties, or far right parties, that are considered not to be extremists. And who are the extremists here? Who is the Economist pitching as the extremists? They're pitching the left as the extremists. And so here we are. This is the direction of travel across Europe. And that's, again, a headline. Always read the Financial Times, always read the Economist. That's where capital has conversations with itself. French bosses build ties with Le Pen as left triggers alarm. So when the French left came together to build that unity and win the election in the sense of being the largest coalition in the parliament, immediately there was conversations between the fascists, the conservative forces, and of course the business community. And so that's what we're seeing emerge across Europe. It's not a defense against the far right. It's the wooing of the far right. It's the bringing of the far right into government across Europe in order to keep the left down. Just as an example of that, one of the first pieces of legislation brought in Finland, when True Finns, or the Finns as they're now called in Finland, one of the first pieces of legislation was the banning of strikes by unions. Now, of course, how we got here is an important issue. And after the crash of 2008, kind of consensus. I know that refers back to the 80s, but it kind of refers to this consensus that emerged in 2010 in Europe. And there was a consensus that austerity was the only way forward. And we've had 16 years of it now. And the results are plain for all of us to see in terms of not just rising inequality, not just a collapse of public services across Europe, by the way, but also the growth of the far right. Because workers and communities, if they will look elsewhere for answers, if they don't see the answers coming from their traditional, if you like, electoral voting basis, whether it was Britain, whether it was Europe, everyone kind of agreed that austerity was the only answer, including the left for the most part, and the social democratic left, electorally speaking. So conservative parties were saying, you know, we're going to punch you in the face, and social democratic parties were saying, don't worry, we'll put on the glove, but you're still getting punched in the face. And that was kind of the approach over the last 16 years. Now, we were told that austerity was necessary for two reasons. One was to reduce national debt, and that complicated graph, the end of it after the red dotted line, is the increase in national debt across Europe. So under its own terms, it's failed. Now, COVID plays a large part in that, but I'm happy to talk about the role of national debt in local economies, because state debt, national debt is not actually a problem. The real problem is corporate debt in the private sector, but that's maybe a debate for another day. The other reason we were told we needed austerity, apart from reducing national debt, which has failed, was to grow the economy. The austerity will grow the economy. Well, 16 years later, the US's economy is through the roof. Some of that is driven by speculation in money markets, but a lot of it's driven by massive state intervention and massive state investment. The Eurozone economy is flatlining, and we're talking about 0 to low growth for the next 10 years. Yesterday, you heard the news about Volkswagen is going to be laying off tens of thousands. I'll repeat that, tens of thousands of workers in the automobile sector and closing down 3 of its major factories, and it won't be the last. In Britain, since 2007, you can see the big dip in COVID there for 2020, and since then, 0 to low growth in GDP figures. And it'd be interesting to see, of course, what happens over the next year, but I don't really see that changing, not with the current policies of the current government, which seem to be relying upon possible investments from private sector. So austerity is a failure under its own terms. Reduce national debt hasn't happened. Grow the economy hasn't happened. But what has happened under austerity then? What actually did austerity do? And maybe what it did do gives us a clue to its ultimate purpose. Well, wage share and trade union density have collapsed. So we're getting less than ever before. Trade union numbers across Europe are down. I think only Italy might have seen a slight increase in trade union members. And so the other result of that, as trade unions collapse in power and in influence and in numbers, is the profits that are being created going to the top of society. So once again, if you like, austerity is neoliberalism on steroids. It's simply the massive transfer of wealth from labor to capital. And every institution and every foundation that does work on this will come up with the same conclusions, is that wages have stagnated, and that the pre-2008 trends, if they had been continued to today, as opposed to what we've seen, which is total stagnation of our incomes. The Resolution Foundation in 2023 said that the average worker in Britain's lost about £11,000 a year. And that is a huge, I mean, that is, you know, we haven't seen that level of wage collapse since the Napoleonic Wars, you know, 200 years. So that's why people are feeling it, and that's why people are in the way they are now. That has an impact on what people think about politics, because too many people are looking at politics going, well, they're all the same, a plague on both your houses. There's you know, you're two cheeks of the same arse, or whatever the phrase might be. And so there's a kind of an anti-politics and anti-establishment feeling emerging, that all politics is to blame. Doesn't matter whether you're left or right or middle or whatever. And that's dangerous, and that breeds kind of hatred of institutions, distrust in institutions. And people, fair enough, are right to be distrustful of institutions. They're right to be distrustful of politics, particularly when it seems that the entire political establishment have kind of agreed with austerity, that they all think that this was the only way forward. So people look elsewhere for answers, and of course, waiting in the wings, far right, with easy answers to complex questions, and encouraging people not to look up at a system, not to look at the collapse of 2008 and what caused that collapse and why we're still in the trough at the bottom of that collapse, but encourage them to punch down and to target minorities and target anybody who wasn't to blame. There was a research report come out last summer called The Political Cost of Austerity, just to kind of reinforce this point. And it was a study of 200 elections across Europe over the last 15 years during that whole austerity period. And like local elections, national elections, European elections. And the findings were fairly obvious, I suppose, but I'll go through them anyway. It's found that in countries where centre-right parties imposed austerity, they often didn't suffer that much. And the reason being, people expect them to do that. That's what they do, what they say they're going to do. It does what it says on the tin. However, in countries where social democratic or socialist parties, at least in name, implemented austerity, two things happen. And this was almost uniform across all the elections. There's a lower election turnout, which reinforces the idea that people just get turned off from politics and start looking for answers elsewhere. And those that do turn out to vote increasingly vote for far right parties as the solution, if you like, to austerity, as a solution to the insecurity and the and vulnerability they're feeling in their own lives. When left-wing governments implement austerity, it directly benefits the far right. Now that shouldn't be. I shouldn't even have to say that. Really, it's so obvious, but there we are. And so we're kind of at a crossroads. There's a really good book there written last year by a mate of ours, Costa Slapovitz. He teaches at I think he teaches at SOAS in London, and the quote is: "The period since 2008 represents a historical interregnum, that period between two systems, in the well-known Gramscian sense that the old is dying but the new cannot be born." And so we're kind of very much historically at a crossroads, really, between the end of neoliberalism, which is kind of wandering around like a zombie, no one quite knows how to put it out of its misery, and the attempt to keep that system up but flourishing when it's actually dead, and what might replace it. Without over egging the pudding or sounding too kind of scary, I think Rosa Luxemburg's quote of, it's either socialism or barbarism is becoming ever truer over the next 10 to 15 years. And so we're seeing politically the convergence of three kind of political dynamics really being woven together as part of modern politics. One, you've got the end of that system, neoliberalism as a 50-year-old project starting in Chile in 1973 and through Reagan and Thatcher right up through the Blair years, which is it's only being kept alive by massive government intervention since 2008, massive central bank intervention, the creation of new money through quantitative easing. Otherwise, the system would have been dead. In order to keep that system alive, if you like, they've turned to far-right populism as a tactic to distract people almost from the serious economic and social crises we have. And far-right populism is about, it's just a distracting thing. It's like, we'll blame everything and anybody else. We'll blame, we'll just turn people's faces away from where the real blame lies. And if that doesn't work, well, then we'll just go to straight out authoritarianism. And we're seeing elements of all of those emerge across Europe at the moment in terms of, a creaking economic system, the use of far-right populism as a tactic to distract workers, and not just distract workers, but to recruit workers to that project. I mean, it shouldn't need said, but I'll say it. Fascism is not a working class phenomenon, it's a ruling class project. The question for us as trade unionists is to what extent they'll recruit members of our class to their project. And how do they recruit them? Through far-right populism. That's one of the main recruitment tactics to distract people away from the kinds of values and the kinds of beliefs and the kinds of things we want to see happening in society. And none of that works. We'll just ban protests, ban trade unions, ban strikes, and lock people up. And we're seeing elements of that authoritarianism, not from Russia, not from China, not from all the other regimes around the world. This is coming from in the heart of liberal capitalist Europe, this slide into authoritarianism. So we can't blame, China and Russia for everything as much as people want to. So the policy of extension of repressive state powers, we're seeing that in France, in Hungary, in Sweden, little in Britain, of course, under the Tories, increase in surveillance and people being surveilled, not just on the streets, but also at work. The severity of police responses to protests and dissent, that's also been exacerbated by people protesting genocide in Palestine and particularly German and French police, and also the British state arresting journalists over the last 3 or 4 weeks who are protesting the same. More exploitative working conditions, of course, for workers, and anti-trade union laws emerging in different parts of Europe. The tactics are the kind of populist tactics. One is the very clever framing of the elite versus the other. And so you have this idea of we the people, and the people is basically means white, really, doesn't it? And then the other is like everyone else we don't like, and that also includes the trade union movement. You've got over focus on culture wars. You get no mention of class or economy or ownership. It's anything really you can distract people about to have conversations rather than talking about the actual crises we face. Anything that damages, the nation's traditional values, although that's very vague. No one quite knows what that means. It's kind of looking at the past with rose-tinted spectacles, I suppose. Above all, and this works really well, is using the politics of resentment. People are rightly angry. People are insecure. People are looking for someone to blame because of the state of their lives. And Naomi Klein said it recently, a couple of months ago, which I thought was really good. She says, the far right get the facts wrong, but they get the emotions right. And I think that's a really good way of understanding this. The left, on the other hand, broadly speaking, gets the facts right, but gets the emotions wrong. I think there's a learning in there for all of us. And so that's kind of a very brief material analysis of where we are. Neoliberalism, the collapse of 2008, the speeding up of those characteristics of neoliberalism, which are about transferring wealth from capital to labor, about inequality and poverty and all the other things. And we could have had that conversation 10 years ago. If we had that conversation 10 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about this next series of themes. And that's the role of the internet really in amplifying and spreading the kinds of ideas and narratives that the far right have been progressing to the point where it's quite frightening. And it's like a huge propaganda machine now, the internet. And it's also, and this is the important thing to remind ourselves, in the same way that Jeff Bezos, oligarchs have always wanted to own the mainstream press. If you own the means of production, so why don't you want to own the means of intellectual production? Because you want to make sure that your ideas and your interests are reflected throughout society. So in the same way that Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, bought the Washington Post, I think it was, it should be no surprise that the owner of Tesla, Elon Musk, bought Twitter, because it makes perfect sense. We first became aware of the role of manipulation, in the internet with Cambridge Analytica. You know the story. I don't need to go into it. There was a company funded by a hedge fund in the city of London. Its first two customers were Saudi Arabia and Israel. So that tells you everything you need to know. But what they did and what they did was illegal. But what they showed us was how you can manipulate how people feel, think, and indeed vote by manipulating social media. And we know that it has had an impact in Europe. The first election where we saw it, apart from Brexit, the first election in Europe where we saw it having an impact was the 2017 election, where you had the AfD being very well funded, very disciplined, and very efficient in their use of social media, to the point where at the last election in Germany 1 month ago, we got a report there recently, just in September, TikTok likely contributed to record AfD vote share in Germany. The idea that TikTok, something you think your teenagers are on and that's insignificant, the AfD social media game is so good, they're building a movement out of it. They have 70 full-time workers working on their social media campaign. And I would argue that the far right and far right parties are about 10 years ahead of where the left are in their manipulation or even use of internet and social media platforms. Now, there was a report a few weeks ago, and the head of MI5 or MI6, British, whatever, spies, stood up and gave a public press conference where he said that Russia were manipulating the internet. And there's been loads of studies about Russia and China. This was one of them. The Russians, it was actually quite a clever one, actually. It's called Doppelganger, and they created lots of different websites that were almost exactly the same as the original website. So they created a website for the Washington Post, for the Financial Times, for the Times of London, and they subtly twisted the headlines to make them slightly more pro-Russian. But it was found and it was closed down within a couple of months. This report by the EU Disinfo Lab, which is a major part of the European Commission, stated that Russia were just a bit shit at it, really. They're not very good at manipulating social media. We know from other reports that most of the manipulation and most of the money to help the far right organize online comes from the United States. So that's where we should concentrate our focus. 28 US right-wing donors groups have spent at least $380 million since 2008 in Europe alone. And that's where they're getting the money from. And that's where they're getting not just the money, but the technical expertise and advice. It's massively had an impact in Ireland. We saw it have an impact, of course, in the riots in Britain in August. This was just before the European elections. Just to give you one example, and there was a hashtag Ireland belongs to the Irish on Twitter that there were millions of these hashtags, and 8% of the accounts that used those or promoted that hashtag came from Britain. Ireland had its own fair share. We've got our own fascist problem. The vast majority came from the United States and from bots and bot accounts. And you know, a bot is a bot farm. You can set them up, you can buy them. It costs about £10,000 a month to have about 10,000 accounts, and they can pump out millions of tweets, and all sorts of content. And what they do is they test it. They test the hashtags, they test the content, and if it works, they draw it all back in. They start pumping out those messages again. It's a huge digital propaganda machine, and that's largely unregulated. The latest research says about 1 in 4 Twitter accounts is a bot. So you're not, and they're getting more sophisticated in the sense that you used to be able to spot them really easily. There's one from the Irish elections, EU elections. If it was someone's name followed by a series of numbers, you knew that was a bot account. But now that doesn't happen anymore. They have full names. And also they're using AI now to make the messages more sophisticated. So they're using proper dialect in the conversation. So you generally think you're talking to a human being. On top of bots, of course, you have the role of actual influencers and people who have used the internet legally but for different reasons. And this is one example, but it's a particularly pernicious example, is of course Andrew Tate. And those of you who know, or those of you who have got kids at school or are involved in education at all, know that I gave a presentation recently for NASUWT that having major problems with a shift in attitude of young men towards young women and girls in terms of violent misogyny and pornography and attitudes. And it is being driven by the Andrew Tate effect. 80% of boys 16 to 17 in Britain have viewed his videos. And it's not even the Hustlers University stuff, which is bad enough, by the way. It's the chat rooms linked to his online sites that are really dark. And that's where the far right are organizing. And that's where the far right are recruiting young men to go down that rabbit hole. And it's kind of like a gateway drug. Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate are kind of like a gateway drug to the far right. And again, we've monitored this, we've studied this. There's loads of reports, and it's really successful, and it's not being regulated, frankly. And influencers, significant numbers of influencers are gateway really drugs to the far right, and it's a problem. And down the rabbit hole they go. There was a conspiracy theory about 4 years ago that 2 American students dreamt up for fun, for the crack, and it spread to millions of people. And that was the conspiracy. The conspiracy was birds aren't real. It has hundreds of thousands of adherents in the United States who believe that birds aren't real. They're actually government spies spying on you. And conspiracies now play, particularly since COVID, they now play a significant role as kind of a recruitment tool again, and the gateway to the far right, because people get sucked down that kind of rabbit hole, and the far right again are there waiting to recruit and to organize people. So that's what we've got. We've got a problem here in terms of a far right digital propaganda machine, which is extremely powerful and influential. The way we communicate with each other has changed. Far right digital strategists understand that in ways that we don't, and using the internet and social media, they have built these powerful machines. So social media is a battlefield, one in which they are sophisticated, well-funded, increasingly powerful. We've got a number of questions to ask ourselves, and I'm happy to talk about the work that we're doing with other partners across Europe. We need to understand how they organize their forces in that space, and they are organized there, and they're well organized. What techniques have they used that have been successful, and what do we do about it? I mean, using the trade union movement as an example, our social media game is awful. Like, we're just shit at it. We're nowhere near the same levels of sophistication and discipline that the far right are. And more importantly, the far right are recruiting our members to their project. That's the thing you don't forget. I'll get on to afterwards with a couple of examples of how I know that, and the stats that tell me how many of our members are sharing and creating far right social media content and voting for far right parties. Just to finish on this, the Financial Times headline, I think this was 2019-20, has Western style democracy become too expensive for capitalism? I mean, think about the implications of that headline. It goes on, the same article. Remember, this was in the FT. This isn't some weird right-wing blog. The central reason why Western democracy is in decline is that its capitalist bedfellow can no longer afford the financial demands that full-blown democracy is placing on it. Full-blown democracy. History has shown that capitalism can adapt. Looking ahead, it will probably find another political host. And you can imagine what that political host is. Politics are balls of void. If the left fails to provide rational, progressive solutions to the growing economic and social traumas, the extreme right will come up with reactionary and irrational ones. And that's, I would argue, is the situation we're in 2024.